Guard your heart above all things. See, there's something about the heart. And it says that we're to guard it. For from the heart flow the issues of life, flows the understanding of life, decisions of life, attitude, perspective. Think about it. It all flows from the heart. The inner life is like an iceberg. Think about it this way. There's a picture on the screen. Again, as I've said before, I've used this illustration before, but think about an iceberg. And what we see above the water represents only 10% of an iceberg. 90% lies below the surface. So what we see is we only see 10%. The majority of the iceberg lies below the surface. And so when you think about your life and you think about your makeup, your being, what we see is very much like an iceberg. We only see 10%. We only see the attitudes and the behavior. We only see the actions. We only see what comes out on the outside. What we don't always see is the 90%, though, that's represented below the surface. And that 90% is represented by our inner life. What's on the inside of us. My character. The secrets of my heart. How I treat others. What I do with what I've been given. What I don't do with what I've been given. All of these things are determined by the 90%. It's determined by what's going on in my inner life, what's going on in my inner world, my motivations, my intentions. Again, my attitudes and behavior, they're determined by this inner life. And the inner part of my world, the inner part of my life and world, listen, it always dictates to the outer. If there's chaos in my outer life, in my public life, it's because there's chaos in my private life. If there's chaos here, there's going to be chaos here. The inner always dictates to the outer. And you'll find with Jesus and much of what Jesus addressed and tried to motivate and inspire and encourage people towards was paying attention to their inner life, paying attention to what's going on in the heart. And that's why guarding our heart is so critical. The writer of Proverbs, he said, guard it above all things, for from it flow the issues of life. It starts there, it begins there. It has to do with the character of our inner lives, of our inner world. It was Jesus who said that we are known by our fruit. The fruit is what we see on the outside. What we don't always see, though, is the motivation. What we don't always see is that 90% that lies below the surface that's going on inside of our world. We get an idea from the outward, but it's the inward, amen, that we don't always see, but it's so important that we guard the inward, that we allow God to work in our character and our inward life so that it can be reflected in our outward life. Jesus, Paul said in Galatians that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faith, gentleness, and self-control. Those are fruit, those are evidences of inward work, right? The inward work of the Holy Spirit, transformation, character shaping, forming. That's what we want. We want more patience. We want more kindness. We want more compassion. We want more gentleness. We want to be kinder, gentler, more loving people. And where does that come? It comes from inner transformation, the transformation of our hearts, of our inner life, of our inner world. That's why Jesus said, if you want to make a person clean, you don't start on the outside of the cup. It says you have to start with the inside of the cup. You make the inside of the cup and then the outside will be clean. See, the Pharisees had it reversed. They thought if you could clean up the outside, if you got the outside right and you took care of the outside, that somehow you would be clean. And Jesus took it and he flipped it and said, no, you have to start with the inside. What's going on in the inside of you? Care about that. Guard that. Be diligent with what's going on in the inner life. Make the inner life clean. That's going to show up in the outer life. Think about it. Evil, sin, the desires to have what we cannot have, goodness, patience, it all begins there with our inner life, our inner world. If you have your Bibles, open up to Luke chapter 18. We're going to read a couple verses together. It's on the screen there, starting in verse 14. actually, verse 9. Thank you. Got a couple misprints there. So 9 to 14, not 14 to 19, sorry. Also, he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. So right away, you know what Jesus is talking about. He's talking to those who self-righteous, those who trusted in themselves, and as a result of their self-righteousness, as a result of trusting in themselves and their own perspective and their own abilities, he said, as a result of that, there are also people who despise others. So those three characteristics kind of sum up where Jesus is going with in this parable, in this story. In verse 10, it says that 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And the Pharisee stood and he prayed thus with himself, saying, God, I thank you that I am not like the other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I give tithes of all that I possess. And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And it's the idea there that he continued to beat. It's not like he beat his breast once. He continued to beat his breast, making a point of that he had this perspective that he needed God, that he understood that he wasn't all that. So we had this person who was all that, and we had this other person who wasn't all that. And Jesus has drawn a comparison there. It says, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Notice what both the Pharisee and the tax collector did. Both the Pharisee and the tax collector, they both went to prayer. So it gives us this idea that they were both religious in this activity. That it's something they both did. They both prayed. They both went to the temple. It was both a part of their regular activity, their regular rhythm of life. Both men, however, did not approach God in the same way. The Pharisee was focused on himself. If you notice 5 times you'll find that he uses the word I. I thank God that I'm not like these other men. I fast twice a week. I give of all that I have. So his focus was on himself. He spoke with himself. It's like this idea that he wanted to hear himself speak. And by hearing himself speak, he hoped that there would be others that heard him speak as well, right? He wanted to be heard. And so he was loud and he prayed out loud, and I thank God that I'm not like these other people. So it's like he wanted to hear his own voice. See, some of us, when we pray, maybe it could be like that a little bit, where it's not so much we're praying to God as much as we're just praying, just to hear ourselves, just to be heard. I mean, that's the reality, isn't it? We could do that. And that's the thought here. And not only that, but the Pharisee compared himself to the tax collector. And we know that there's something about something that's not healthy when we compare ourselves with other people. And so here he is, he's comparing himself, he's lifting himself up, and as he lifts himself up, what does he do? And he's putting down the tax collector. So he's comparing himself. And here's the reality with life. And if you want to play that game, listen, we'll always be able to find someone at a lower place and a lower position than we are. So if that's what we need to make ourselves feel better, it won't be hard, right? We can look around us and we'll always find someone who's at a worse off position, who's a little bit lower, a little less righteous, a little less put together than we are. And that was the Pharisee. And he rejoiced not for who God was, but for who he was. Notice the emphasis again was upon what he did. He fasted. He trusted in himself. His righteousness was not established in grace. His righteousness was established in his form, in what he was able to accomplish and what he was able to do. It says he trusted in himself. His trust and focus of the Pharisee was in a different place than that of the tax collector. So notice, though, what the tax collector did. It says he didn't think too much of himself. Again, he beat his chest and he said, God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. So he understood. He approached God with humility. He understood his position, that he wasn't approaching God out of a place of strength, but rather he was approaching God out of a place of weakness. He understood that he was weak, That his righteousness wasn't determined by his own ability, by his own skill set, by his own good deeds. He come humbly and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. He understood his position, that he had need for a Savior. His trust and his focus was in a different place. So if you think about that and you juxtapose the Pharisee with the tax collector, and we ask, what's the difference? I think the difference comes down to what was going on in the inner life of the Pharisee and what was going on in the inner life of the tax collector. Again, guard your heart above all things, for from it flow the issues of life. Our inner character, listen, will find its way out. You and I can only reproduce who we are. We can't reproduce who we intend to be, who we hope to be, who we want to be. When you think about our children, and we think about what we want to reproduce in others, who we are, what we are, is the only thing that can be reproduced. Our public life, how we live our life in front of others, is a reflection of our private life. And the thing is, with the Pharisees, they were known as hypocrites. Right? Because they put on this great display in the outward life, and yet their inward life didn't express the character, didn't line up with their public life. And so the goal is we want there to be alignment between the private life and the public life, so that the character that you and I exhibit and express inwardly, that's being developed inside of us, that is the character that's coming out in our public life. Think about fruits of the Spirit. You think about the idea of integrity. You think about the idea of honesty. You think about the idea of treating others the way we want to be treated. Where does that begin? It starts in the heart. It starts here. And that's what Jesus wants to transform, is our heart, our inner life, our inner world. So there are three things today that I want to talk about that you and I can practice. Three things that will help in the shaping of that inner character so that we can live the public life, so that there can be alignment between the private and the public. Three things that we can do to help create an atmosphere for God to work, to move, to transform, to change. So you and I can have the confidence to live the life that God says that we can live. 2 Peter 2:11 says, "Behold, or beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul." So in our Christian perspective, there is a war that's being waged. And it's a war between the spirit and the flesh. And the flesh is that selfish side of us. The flesh is that thing in us that desires to feed our own appetites, to be recognized, to be popular, to be, somebody on YouTube, to make lots of money, to have lots of things, right? To be famous, to have whatever we want, whenever we want it, as long as it makes us feel good. That is the fleshly side. But there's this other side that you and I are to cultivate. It's the side of character. And Paul writes, and he says there, or Peter did there, and Paul writes in Romans, that they are at war. The flesh and the spirit are at war. And so we want to win the war. So there are things that we can do to win the war in our inner life, okay? Certain things that we can practice that will help us to create space, or to, let's say it this way, to help keep the flesh at bay, in check, subdued, under, finding less expression in our lives. Bishop Wilson of the Isle of Man, he said this is a quote I found in a book, says, "Those who deny themselves will be sure to find their strength increased, their affections raised, and their inward peace continually augmented." Jesus said, anyone who wants to follow me must pick up his cross and deny himself and follow me. So these practices are about creating that space for character shaping to take place in our inner lives. So the idea is to abstain from certain things for certain periods of time, for the benefit of our soul, for the benefit of perspective, for the benefit of the ordering of our inner worlds. Because we need to order our inner life, right? So there are certain practices that we can do that will help to order those appetites, to make sure that the right things are finding expression in our lives. Again, because we're at war. So there has to be a right ordering. When the order is out of whack, when there's chaos in our ordering, when Jesus is not first in our ordering, it's going to show up in our outer life, in our public life. So we need to learn how to order our inner worlds. And so here are 3 practices that we can do to help with the ordering of our inner world. First thing is to practice silence. Now, I get it. In our culture, the very word silence could be something that we push against because it is so contrary to what the world says around us. It's all about noise. The practice of silence involves that of shutting off, or shutting ourselves off, I should say, from sound. It involves the practice of abstaining, of unplugging from the sound of music, from the sound of noise, from the sound of words, from the sound of our iPhones, our phones going off, clicking with updates. Got a good case on that thing. Right, with social media updates, want to know what's going on with our likes, with our posts, what's going on with the news. See, our phones, some of us, our phones are set up to ding every time we get something important. So we're drawn to these. And so it involves unplugging. It involves taking seasons and times and moments to unplug and to walk away from those things, to cut them off, to shut them off, to cut off the noise. Noise, just like many other things, can get in the way of intimacy with Jesus. You need to hear this. Jesus desires an intimate relationship with you. And so it's important that sometimes we reflect on those things that get in the way of intimacy. What are those things that are captivating our heart, that are standing in the way of greater intimacy? And often you'll find it's the noise of life that gets in the way of intimacy, that serves as a great distraction to closeness of relationship, where we can find ourselves so preoccupied with noise that it's hard for the voice of God, that it's hard for the Spirit of God to get through because our minds are so clouded with noise. The noise of all that we have going on. There can be so much of it that it's hard for him to get through. Think about it. There were times where Jesus would get away from the crowds, where he'd get away from the demands, where he'd get away from the people and all the noise. Why? So that he could just be by himself, so he could be alone, in a place where he's alone. And I think about that. We don't know exactly what happened in those moments, those times, but I imagine in many of those moments he did nothing. He just sat silently, unplugged, got away from it all. And some of you are like, you have no idea what my life's like. You have no idea about the noise. I don't, but I can imagine, and I have my own noise and my own demands and my own kids and the demands, all that comes with that. And there's something about the idea of getting away, seasons, times, moments, and unplugging and finding a place just to be silent, just to be quiet, where I don't say anything, where I don't have my phone, where I don't have all the things racing around in my mind that have to be done and things that I need to do. Doesn't that sound attractive? There's something about that just sounds attractive. That sounds good to me. So what if we found a way to unplug for times and seasons just to be quiet, to be left to nothing other than what's directly right in front of us, which would be this, and him. But that's the kicker, isn't it? That's the hard part, because that is hard. And what's hard about that is often what it is it's the noise that we use to hide behind. And as long as we can stay busy enough, and as long as we can have this noise in our minds, often it's the noise that keeps us from being honest with ourselves and being honest in a place to be able to hear God and to be honest and be able to deal with the things that are going on in the inside of us, emotionally, spiritually, internally. It's easy to hide behind the noise. It's easy to hide behind words because as long as I have words, then I don't have to deal with some of those internal things. So I can find myself hiding in that place. Scary. Listen, there are times, and I'm very thankful for it, right? Aren't you? That God moves in the noise. God can reach you in the noise. God can get through to you and I through the noise. But somehow it seems to me that it's more likely that if you and I will get away and actually create space of quietness, that will be the place where we'll find that God more often than not meets us. Where we'll have the opportunity to experience and hear his voice. It's when we create intentional space to be quiet and be silent. And there have been ancients and those before us that have practiced this for good reason, and yet we live in a culture that's more busier and more noisy than ever before. So it seems to me that this should be more important than ever before in the time of history. Seems to me more often, though, that God is experienced away from the noise and in the silence. In the silence. If you think about the story of Elijah, I thought about the story of Elijah, and Elijah was running from from Ahab, King Ahab's wife, Jezebel. And she put a hit out on his life, and so he was running for his life. He was filled with fear and intimidation by her and that spirit, and so he was running, and he found himself at a place where he needed God to speak to him, and it's there that God met him, and God said that he wanted him to go out and find a place on the cleft of a rock. And it says that he went out, and it's there that there was the sound of the wind. It was loud. It was so loud, it says that the mountains shook, right? And that rocks began to crumble and fall down all around him. There was the noise of a demonstration of power. And it says that God wasn't in the noise of the wind of that particular demonstration. There was a great earthquake, but God wasn't in the earthquake. There was a great fire, but he wasn't in the fire. And then it says, then there was the sound of a gentle blowing, and then the voice came. In the quietness, in the silence, it's there that Elijah heard the voice of God. It was Mother Teresa who said, we need to find God. He cannot be found in noise and restlessness. God is the friend of silence. Listen, silence can be your friend. See how nature, trees, flowers, grass grows in silence. See the stars, the moon, and the sun, how they move in silence. We need silence to be able to touch souls. You and I need space, silent space, quiet space in our lives so that we can thrive as humans. Isaiah 30:15 says, in quietness and confidence shall be your strength. Our strength shall be in what? In quietness and confidence. Psalm 46:10 says to be still and know that he is God. I think that more of us would live with a quieter inner confidence if we practice silence more. So I just want to ask you, are you afraid of silence? And what would it look like if you created space in your life, systems, rhythms, practices, where you could get away and just create that space? What would it look like for you? What would it do to your intimacy, to your relationship, to your inner life? The second thing I want to encourage us and challenge us with is to practice not only silence, but to practice fasting. To practice fasting. Now, anyone, if you've never fasted before, you might not understand this on the same level, but anyone who's practiced fasting, who's fasted from eating or drinking, you understand just how much of our world revolves around food. It's the social aspect, it's the physical aspect, it's the comfort aspect, it's that aspect of pleasure and what we look to and forward to in food, right? It's all those things, and those things are good. But there's something when we take time from those things and we fast from those things, when we abstain from those things that remind us of a few things. They remind us some things about God, and they remind us about some things about ourselves. If you think about the times that you've feasted, it's important that you and I feast. Feasting represents celebrating something good, celebrating something great that's going on in our lives. So it's important that we feast. But we feast and we don't always fast. So we get the benefits and the value of feasting, but sometimes we don't value the benefits of fasting, of withholding, of abstaining from certain things like food and drink. So feasting reminds us of all the things we should celebrate. Fasting, on the other side, it reminds us of things like the importance of self-control. It reminds us of the importance that food shall not be our master. That pleasure in a deeper level, that pleasure shall not be the thing that masters us, that we live for. That it's all we think about and revolve our lives around. It reminds us how much we look to food, again, to make us feel better, to cover for a lack of self-worth, to overcompensate for a lack of exercise or rest. I was thinking about my family, and when we feast and we celebrate something, we go to Spaghetti Factory. It's like our restaurant of choice, right? Just kind of family friendly, and it's good. So when there have been major accomplishments in my life or my family's life, we'll go to, hey, let's go celebrate at the Spaghetti Factory. Or it'll be Menchie's or anything involving ice cream. So this past week, my son, Jaden, we just found out he got in to go to school in Tacoma at the School of the Arts. And we've been trying. We tried with Hannah, we tried with Luke, and so through a couple of different kids couldn't get in. Jaden finally got in, and it's like, Jaden's like, what are we going to do to celebrate? And sometimes even when, it's not really big things, the kids are like, what are we going to do to celebrate? Dad, let's go get ice cream. They always want to celebrate with ice cream, right? So we celebrate with ice cream, and those things are good. And I also know on the other side that when I'm feeling low, when I'm feeling down, what do I like to do sometimes is I like to, turn to comfort food, right? Like macaroni and cheese or ice cream's the big thing. It's like a feast thing, and it's the other side too, right? Look to for comfort. But fasting helps to bring food into its right place. Listen, not as a master, but as a servant. As a servant. By abstaining from food and drink, we are turning our attention to God. We're saying that He is the bread of life, that He is our substance, that He is our sustenance, that He's the one that we want to center our lives around. And so when we abstain, it reminds us of that. It gives us that opportunity to create that space and to come back to that perspective and say, okay, again, I'm centered in this. I get it. This is what it's all about. See, fasting affords us that opportunity to truly feast on Him as the bread of life. It was John 6:35 that Jesus said to those that were in the crowd, to His disciples, those following Him, those in the audience, He said, I am the bread of life, and whoever eats of me, whoever drinks of me, will not grow hungry, will not grow thirsty. Spiritually, reminding ourselves of the importance of that He is our substance, that we are to look to Him for life. So think about it, our fundamental drives, our desires, they're tempered. They're tempered through fasting with self-control and moderation. The results of fasting. And that's what we want to do. We want to live a life again where those fleshly desires, those fleshly appetites, because it's much bigger than food, where those things don't win, where those things aren't out of control in our inner lives. Fasting helps in that. So I'm not talking about fasting to get us out of trouble. And then there may be times in our lives where we're so low, maybe and it involves an addiction, or maybe because we're desperate, because we have a family member that's experiencing crazy things, and maybe as a church we're just going through a tough season or a tough time. Right? There are times where that we may need to fast. And those things are important and those things are right and we should, but I'm also talking about those seasons, those times that we do on a regular basis, on a systematic basis. That we do because it's just a part of our rhythms. To help us keep things in perspective, to stay centered, to curb our appetites, to keep them in check, to keep us centered in a place where Jesus is first. Now, this could consist of periods of times. It could be seasons. It could be weekly. It could be a meal. It could be, just during a time in your life. But I encourage you to think about, what could I do? The benefits are profound. And listen, they don't make us. They're not the things that make us righteous. They're not the things that we look to as being the things that spiritually, lift us up. Remember, it's the things that we do. It creates the atmosphere for Jesus to be the one that lifts us up. For him to be the one we draw life from, that we look to, we center on. Romans 8:5 says, "For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit." So fasting helps us to live in the space of the Spirit. And that's where you and I, we want to live more, right? We want to live more in that place. Where the appetites of our life don't consume us and overtake us, but or the appetites of the flesh, but where the appetites of the Spirit, they overtake us. They consume us. They meet us in that place. I mentioned the first gathering. It made me think this morning of Simeon the Stylite from the 5th century. He got kicked out of monastery because he was so radical. Think about monastery and some of the things that they did in monastery to set themselves apart, to be dedicated to God, to prove devotion. Right? He was so fanatical, radical in it. There wasn't a place for him in the monastery. Here's a guy that would confine himself to small spaces for periods of time. He went out and lived in rocks, in a cave for a while. And then he limited himself to a very small space, and then he moved to a pillar. He lived 37 years of his life on a pillar. 37 years! Confined to a small space on top of a pillar. That first pillar was 9 feet tall. By the end of his life, he was on a pillar up to 50 feet tall. Lived on the top of that. Prayed and fasted and just lived this life dedicated unto God. And for most of us, yeah, I get that. I'm not trying to say that's what we're supposed to do by any means, but what it is with that is there's something attracted, though, about the simplicity of life and being able to unplug in such a way and say, God, I'm yours. Yeah, we have bills and we have children and we have lives and education. All those things are important. But there's something about, though, this idea of being connected in such a way with God. 37 years. All right. Last thing. So, silence, fasting. The last thing is secrecy. Now, maybe the first thing you think of when I said secrecy is, all right, you want me to keep secrets? Well, yes, but only certain kinds of secrets. If you go back to the Pharisee in the story, the Pharisee made a point of what? He made a point of calling out his good deeds, calling out his spirituality, calling out the things that he did. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be recognized. Again, as a Pharisee, one of the things with the Pharisees, Jesus called them hypocrites because they were great actors. They were great showmen. And again, there wasn't this alignment between their attitude and their actions and their heart, their behavior, and what was going on in their inner world. So he made a point of making himself known so that he could be recognized, he could be honored. It says the Pharisees, they liked the best seat at the table. So if they were invited to your table, they would look for the best seat, the place of honor. Not only that, when they fasted, they would often contort their faces so that you would know that they're fasting. They wanted others to recognize their spirituality. So they were guilty of making a show out of their spirituality, and they wanted to be seen, recognized, and honored. They were looking for the praise of men more than they wanted the praise of God. And anyone who's a people pleaser understands this challenge. Ultimately, at the end of the day, at the end of our lives, what do you and I want more? Do we want the praise of God, or do we want the praise of man? What the practice of secrecy does is it puts us in a place where we're looking for the praise of God more than the praise of man. In contrast to being seen, recognized, and honored for being somebody and doing some things, here's what Jesus had to say in Matthew chapter 6, verses 4. Actually, just verse 1. Jesus said, "Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men, to be seen by them, otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet." Do not blow your trumpet, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, you have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be seen, may be in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. And when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray, standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say to you, they will have their reward. But you, when you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. Secrecy, in this sense, is the discipline of valuing the praise of God more than the praise of men. So what that means is when you do something good for another person, the next time you do it, don't put it all over Facebook. The next time you help somebody, don't call up all your friends and say, "Hey, look what I just did." And the next time you have a great experience with God, yeah, maybe tell a few people, but don't broadcast it to everyone. And the next time you fast, don't make your face look like you're the most miserable human being on the face of the earth so that they have to ask you, "Why are you so miserable?" Well, it's because I'm fasting again today. That's the value of secrecy. Looking not to be propped up from others, to be praised and honored for what we do, but to be able to take that humble position that even if nobody finds out about it, that you and I are good enough with that God says, "I will reward you." Even if nobody notices, recognizes, says anything to you, for you and I to be okay with that. Secrecy tames our appetites to make a name for ourselves. And with the YouTube phenom, or just the thing, what is it? It's all about fame and wanting to be somebody and do something. And so we have to get it out there. There's something about pulling away, taking seasons and times and moments to be secret with what we do. And to be okay that if we never get praise for it, if we never get accolades for it, if we never get recognized for it, to be able to say, "Okay, I did that, and God sees, and God knows, and God ultimately will be the one who rewards me." So the idea of secrecy places our deeds and virtues into the hands of God. And what if we did that sometimes? That if we left it in his hands and allowed him to be the one that either brought it into the light, and for him to be the one who determines whether that or not that gets recognized. What if we did that more? What if?